Economic survey has been tabled in Parliament. The finance minister did it a short while ago. But what does it mean for the budget which is going to come tomorrow? Joining us today on Squirrels, it's a great honor to have Deepanshu Mohan, who's professor and dean at the Jindal Global University, and also visiting professor in Oxford and LSE. Deepanshu, from the top of my head, I think the first headline the headline that we're going to see tomorrow is going to be this business of the GDP number. What do you make of that?
So thank you for having me here. See, if you look at the growth number that is out in the survey report, I think the number is 6.4% of the real
Right.
GDP. The range for FY26 of the Indian economy is given to be between 6.3 and 6.8%. If you see the rate to be as the way it is, it seems that the average growth picture is normalizing to the trend of what India's growth scenario was prior to the pandemic. So what happened was suddenly you saw the Indian economy shooting down with the lockdown being announced, and then as soon as things started opening up, you had a sudden surge where you had a very high double-digit growth picture. But now what you see is that we're returning back to the pre-pandemic normal, which, as few of us were writing on the state of the Indian economy, was already performing at a suboptimal level. Since 2016, India's growth has not picked up beyond, one would say, on an average 6.5%. Now, in a general relativist sense, you would say that 6.5% is a good growth picture given how the world is functioning.
Right.
But for India's scenario and the stage of development we are at, any growth rate below 8 to 9% is mostly what we'd say is unacceptable. The reason for that is because of the nature of distributive challenges that the growth presents. The gross value added growth for manufacturing and otherwise has been more or less stagnant. The main contributor to the growth story is a higher sort of increase or relative higher sort of increase in rural demand consumption. But what's been driving India's growth story has been the increase in government expenditure on capex and other things, which budget after budget the government has been trying. So, private sector investment or consumption demand, all of which you would consider as to be critical for the growth story, have not been shooting up. And I think that's where really the problem is on the growth side. At the
So
same
I'm
time, what you
going
see,
Dipanshu,
yeah.
sorry, I'm going to hold you for a second, and we will talk about private consumption because it's an important point you've brought up. But let me quickly move you. There's also a lot of space and lots of words that have been dedicated to the global challenges that India and the rest of the world is facing. And largely it's protectionism, given what, having Trump having come in, he's very clear: tariff, protection, America first. And there is a combined, alongside with this is also the challenge of jobs by way of getting challenged by AI. What do you make of these two things in the economic survey?
So I would probably say that the protectionist challenge in India's scenario is a more which is an internal challenge rather than an external one. Yes, clearly India, given the circumstances of how the uncertainty of what the world economy looks like, we've seen this to be called as the age of uncertainty and polycrisis. There have been crises after crisis in the last 8 to 10 years. So India's economy, in that sense, has not done as bad as a lot of other emerging markets have. But what's been the challenge is the political economy challenge, the internal level. Our agricultural sector has not opened up for exports the way it wanted to. We had very ad hoc, what you would consider as import duty cuts on the ban of exports in case of onions, wheat, rice, which was suddenly done, and that would affect negatively, of course, the farming enterprises and producer organizations. Textiles have been a sector which, to a certain extent, you've seen exports in processed, raw made, handmade products go up in garments, but the potential of this is still untapped. renewables. India's been seen as sort of the poster child for solar energy and other equipment-based, manufacturing. So, in each of these areas, while there is some higher bunch of exports going up, we've imported way more than what our export margins, which means our current account deficit has been high. The only area you would see that India has done relatively well is on services when it comes to that, and which is what your question relates to. With Trump coming in,
That's been traditionally our
traditionally
strength.
been the case, but no, even the last few years, services, particularly low value added services, have also been doing very well. And where India's potential, and I would imagine that the next month's meeting between the two leaders, Prime Minister Modi and President Donald Trump, is going to be extremely crucial, is going to be on the visa issues for allowing skilled capital labor mobility
Right.
from India to the US, which is where India has had a trade surplus with the US. I don't really think that the tariff war or the weaponization of the tariff tool, as Trump tends to do, is going to impact India's relationship with the US because India doesn't
Yeah.
import extensively on goods. It's a
Right.
service-based
Right.
partnership. But there is restriction on the immigration issue, as you know that it's been one of the main political issues for Trump's rise to power in this election. So one would need to see, but I'm anticipating that one would need India now in its own trade policy orientation to diversify, look at newer markets for cooperation. I think there is an effort to already do so, but the internal challenge is a larger one than the external one. I think there is a
Right.
resistance in the internal scenarios for not opening up the markets as much as possible. I mean, Professor Arvind Panagria, who is now a member of the head of the Finance Commission, has said it himself that
Right.
we are being more protectionist than what we need. So
Right.
that's where we really need to move. Yeah.
That basically protectionism for the private sector.
No, I mean protectionism in terms of restricting yourself from tapping to your own possibilities for trade,
Hmm.
and also which affects, of course, your industries. So it's
Right.
it's it's trade-based protectionism which is affecting your industrial growth as
But
well.
if you see this time, you must have read it as did I. The economic survey actually puts a lot of stress now on the private sector. It
Hmm.
says it's time for the private sector to basically pick up the ball and start running. They said we've done the government's done enough. It's your turn now. I think the term and one of the phrases they've used is excess profit. I think a flood of excess profit or something like this. What do you make of that?
No, so Sudeep, this has been a point year after year. Again, a lot of us who've been observing the Indian economy critically have said that the government has been excessively large-hearted and generous when it comes to the sort of higher elite private sector investors. The hope was that with government investing in higher capex infrastructural spending, the crowding in effect of that for the private sector would happen. The answer to this is that the private sector, if you would see across sectors, right, from manufacturing to industrial productivity of existing advantages of automobile and other spaces, you have not seen the private sector increasing capacity of investment. And the answer to that lies a lot in the question of urban consumption demand. If you don't have high urban consumption demand, which is your principal growth engine, you will not see the private sector investing more because
Right.
there will be less. And there are a number of reports and data points on this that capacity utilization of additional investment by the private sector is not high. So why
Hmm.
would you expect the private? So what you're
Right.
seeing is greater disinvestment, fire sale of assets or purchase of those by those who can afford it. And as a result, you've seen that the profitability and wealth asset endowment of these higher, what you consider as the top 5% of private companies has gone up, which is what is leading to a very unequal or unequal private sector landscape. You only have the top sort of 5 or 10 key industrial houses or business houses dictating what you would consider as the investment landscape. And
Hmm.
that's more
Hmm.
troubling because you will see them investing in areas or in countries where there's possibility of higher profitability. Now, the government can do two of those things. Now, the budget is coming tomorrow. One, and we are expecting a lot of changes around tax reform. The middle class clearly is expecting a hand in terms of getting more higher disposable income. I feel that's very critical to urban consumption demand. It will help in allowing the middle class strata to increase their expenditure. But what you need is also assess or at least a temporary wealth tax for the higher profit margins that is being accumulated in the private sector. Because if the government's argument and if the chief economic advisor is clearly saying this in no unsaid terms that the profitability has gone up but not the investment, then the government's job would be to come in and say that, all right, we're going to tax this excess area. And they've been doing that in capital gains in many areas. But the burden, the incidence and the burden of the tax has been disproportionately falling on middle classes and low income groups because of the nature of tax structure.
So would you expect, I mean, I'm assuming like everybody else in the middle class is expecting some kind of a tax cut, which would boost some kind of consumption.
My sense is of a restructuring of the tax strata, which
Okay.
doesn't mean that you would see as much as an announcement of saying the oh, middle class would not have to, there's a cut or an increase. But you would see that the it's been long coming actually. The brackets, the tax brackets that are there of percentage of tax levy for indirect tax it's been expected that they would change
Right.
because of two things. The value of the rupee has gone down because
Right.
and that's affected the purchasing power. In simple terms for your audience, the 1 lakh rupees of 10 years back will not buy you exactly what you would buy now. It will hardly buy you, in fact, 10 times less. So the
Mhm.
value of the rupee, intrinsic value of the rupee has gone down. And at the same time, you also have a situation of a very high tax incentives or burden on the middle and low income groups. So, of course, you expect the tax structure to change. I'm anticipating that to happen, but I'm also hoping that the private sector or much of what you consider as the wealthy endowed classes are asked to pay a lot more because the direct tax burden on them, as you know, I mean, the statistics is that 65% of those filing income tax returns do not pay any direct tax. It's a huge number, which
Not
is
just that,
which,
it's not just on taxes, it's also the fact that the government has told the private sector that job creation too also something that you need
yes,
to.
absolutely. So that's the other thing. Now, so the answer to that, which a lot of people say, if you ask in the manufacturing space and the MSME space, which has been decimated from 2016, right from demonetization and GST, the MSME sector has not been able to sort of revive itself. You have to understand that 80% of your labor intensive hiring or employment is generated by the MSME sector. So that's where really a lot of the incentives need to go. But if you look at the numbers, the skill gap deficiency is hurting the Indian economy more than anything else.
Mhm.
You have a situation now that 90% of India's workforce is less than secondary level educated,
Right,
right?
right.
90%. You have 88% of the jobs that are being created in low skill segments. So it's not as if you don't have jobs for security guards, construction
Yeah.
workers, masons, but they're all getting the same wage that they were getting 10 years back, which is
Right.
where the whole demand problem has surfaced.
But tell me, it now, listening to you and also, having read the document, do you think very quickly, as the last question I want to ask you, do you think it's this is a perfect storm where one can expect a 1991 kind of a, I mean, it's not the best reference to have, but for lack of any other reference, 1991 type big reforms, because it's the government is constantly talking about the document is constantly talking about deregulation. Do you
Yeah.
think we're heading towards a situation where you could see 1991 2.0, as it were?
So two questions there, of course, I think embedded. Deregulation, I feel, is happening as a crisis response of the inability of the government to engage and conduct its own operations effectively in public sector enterprises. You have to look at the state of public sector enterprise in the last 10 years. And the evidence of that would tell you much in case of operative functioning, most PSEs are struggling. So yes, the idea was for disinvestment. They're using a word deregulation now for allowing for more private capital to come in, but the private capital has not come in as what the government would have expected. The gross capital fixed formation rate is more or less at the same level as it was in 2013. So last 11 years, you've not seen the capital development happening from the private sector the way you would envisage. So the second part to that is whether you go back to the 1991 story. Now, it's more or less, I would say, fashionable to say that 1991 was the big bang structural reform era budget.
Right.
I don't think this government in its third term has the capacity or the political will to go for big bang announcements. It will do minor tinkering with its tax structures, and the PR machinery would take over. I say it for the simple reason because the execution capacity of the current government to meet its own disinvestment targets, to meet its own budget estimates. If you look at the
Right.
data on revised estimates of each union budget, you would find that it's not able to meet those targets. So
Right.
it's more of the capacity of execution rather than the will. That would be a challenge.
So
So I
no,
don't expect a
yeah,
1991
don't
2.0.
expect it. That I think we leave it there. Thanks, Dipanshu, so much for joining us, and let's see what tomorrow brings. And hopefully, you'll be able to join us tomorrow as well. It was very nice.
Thank you, Sudeep. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.